So welcome to our lecture, part of our lecture series today on Europeanization processes in Southeastern Europe. This is our first class after the Easter break. I'm extremely delighted to welcome Diana Mishkova to our class in Graz. And we were just discussing how it's easier to come to Sofia from Graz in these circumstances, even though, of course, it's not quite the same not to have Diana in this classroom. She is a professor of history and director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Sofia. She's also a foreign corresponding member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And she's worked extensively as a historian on the relations between the Balkans and Europe. She's published a number of volumes on the entangled history of the Balkans. And just a few years ago, a volume on the conceptualizations of the Balkans in the Mirror Europe with Routledge, which very much fits to our current topic. And she will be talking today about beyond Balkanism. The Balkan Self in the Mirror of Europe is the presentation today, and the book title is Beyond Balkanism: The Scholarly Politics of Region Making. So it's very much part of her work, and she's been dealing with this for a long time. And I'm very glad, Diana, that you agreed to present your research and your thoughts on this topic, which I think very much helps to conceptualize discussing Europeanization in a more contemporary environment to kind of get the kind of historical background and depth to it. So without further ado, Diana, the floor is yours. And then, as all of you know, we'll have a conversation after the presentation. So please, Diana.
Okay. Thank you very much, Florian. Thank you for this invitation. Rest assured that I would have been much more delighted if I could communicate with you in live. I believe everyone by now has got tired and sort of running out of steam in front of these screens. But let's hope that this will be this is soon to end, and we can really communicate in real human terms. So my talk today inscribes into, or rather takes issue with the by now sizable literature of imageological critique and mental mapping, in which Balkanism, in other words, the popular Western discourse positing an ontological and epistemological distinction between European self and Balkan other, has acquired a prominent status over the last few decades. Since the 1990s, the Balkans has become actually the favored European deconstruction site for contrived geographies and reductionist representations hinging on the hegemonic relationship between Western and Eastern Europe. In fact, the impact of looking at the Balkans through the prism of Balkanism has been such that in recent years, Balkan studies have acquired the reputation of an academic field that has most fruitfully adopted and contributed to the analysis of Orientalism. Significantly, this body of literature draws, however, overwhelmingly upon texts produced outside academic confines, like fiction, journalism, travel writing, political statements, diplomatic records, film, and to the almost complete exclusion of academic Balkanism. This stands in stark contrast to the studies of Orientalism, which, as Said once argued, is ultimately derived from an academic body of work. Methodologically and theoretically, therefore, it raises the question about whether or to what extent a narrative built around the relation of knowledge to power can dispense with scientific discourse and institutions that generate epistemes and regimes of truth. For while we can easily grant that compared to media, traveling, and fiction, scholarship plays a lesser role as a channel of disseminating intercultural images, and that scholarly discourse obeys rules that restrict overt political or ideological implication, it nevertheless performs the crucial functions, the academic discourse, the scholarly discourse, nevertheless performs the critical function of providing the resources for legitimation and empowering political discourses. After all, knowledge as power is taken to be a natural consequence of the inability of the Orient or the Balkans to create its own self-representation. Against this backdrop, my response in the book that Florian kindly mentioned, that was published a couple of years ago, has been rightly read as an undisguised riposte to the Balkanist take on the notion of the Balkans, in that it juxtaposes Western Balkanism with the understandings of the Balkans that have emerged from within the region, especially from academically embedded discursive practices and political usages. For me, taking this direction means more than just digging up, unearthing a long but understudied and unreflected tradition of scholarly preoccupation with what we can safely assume to be a paradigmatic historical region of Europe. It means, firstly, bringing this tradition to bear on the relationships of Europe with its periphery, and also engaging with the ways the inhabitants of the Balkans reacted to their quote-unquote subaltern status is fraught with implications that transfigure the whole semantics of Balkanism, rather than a system of fixed, locally mimicked negative images. It becomes a terrain of multiple competing conceptualizations that might replicate and internalize, but also react against, oppose, resist, or manipulate this system of representation. Such a reversal of perspective at the same time foregrounds the ways Europe and its parts were conceived as symbolic spaces from its margins, and highlights the intimate relationship between processes of spatialization and identity formation on a national and transnational scale. Yeah. So, as it is known, the perception and naming of the Balkans as a single region does not predate the early 19th century. Until almost the end of that century, it was associated not so much with a fixed territory as with the geopolitical implications of the so-called Eastern question. The institutionalization of the study of the Balkans came about in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, along with the ultimate disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. Up until the Second World War, the tendency to treat the Balkans or Southeastern Europe, European states en bloc had, as a rule, political and economic incentives. Discrete foreign academes, however, participated with varying weight and proficiency in the regional conceptualizations. On the whole, while proximity and imperial expansion ensured the almost uninterrupted German political and economic involvement in the area, German language scholarship, both Austrian and German, contributed most to the extensive and painstaking study of the area and the stabilizing of the Balkans as a historical region. For the better part of the pre-Second World War period, the British interest, on the other hand, in the area was aligned with the framework of the Near East, which put the whole Balkan problematic in a specific light. The French academic approach to Les Balkans was shaped mainly by fears of the pan-German economic and political thrust in the area. This explains the French preoccupation with the South Slavs, who were portrayed as the moral, political, and racial opposite and the strategic counterforce to the Germans. For Russia, on the other hand, studying the Balkan religious and ethnic brethren, единоверци и единоплеменники, meant not only extending Russian influence in the region, but also bolstering Russia's historical consciousness, Slavic identity, and imperial status. That being said, the relationship between imperialism or strategic interest and academic engagement was not necessarily a straightforward one. While the larger German, British, French, and later American geopolitical stakes determined to a great extent the scale of academic investment, Italian imperialist pursuits in the region in the interwar period failed to engender academic interest, while Russian imperial cartography operated with various configurations, the Slavic world, the Balkans, or a satellite Eastern Europe. Within the region, we can analytically distinguish 4 periods of academic regionalization. It is quite significant that the first regional self-representations emerged as parallel identity projects amidst the dynamic phase of European nation-state building. The period of the ultimate dismantling of Turkey in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, marked as it was by radicalization of national discourses, also saw the inception of an encompassing Balkan and Southeast European entity. Nation-state building and the construction of an overarching regional unity at that time went hand in hand and were compatible. Different disciplines participated with varying weight in creating Balkan regionality and in defining its attributes. In the origin of the Balkans as a unitary notion, the then vanguard comparative linguistics played a key role. Today, the Balkan linguistic area or linguistic league is considered as the first area of contact-induced language change to be identified as such, and the model prototype for language interaction and convergence. Linguists were the first to use the term balkanism to indicate, contrary to the present-day resignification of the term, the opposite of fragmentation, a lexical and, more importantly, grammatical feature shared among the unrelated or only distantly related languages of the Balkans, Slavic, Romance, Albanian, Greek, and Turkish. Such morphological similarities among the Balkan languages, let us again remember that these are all languages belonging to different language families. They came to be increasingly interpreted, these morphological similarities, as testimony to centuries of multilingualism and interethnic contact at the most intimate levels. The linguistic approach to the Balkans stirred other academic fields to turn their attention to phenomena like contact, interaction, and convergence. According to Nicolae Iorga, Romania's foremost historian before the Second World War, regional history revealed a number of similarities strikingly reminiscent of the Balkan linguistic union. Iorga postulated the existence of a fundamental unity resting on archaic traditions, a particular culture and heritage common to the whole European Southeast. He claimed that this unity was drawing upon the great Thraco-Illyrian Roman tradition, had been then epitomized by Byzantium and later the Ottoman Empire, and was enshrined in a wide range of common institutions. On their part, literary scholars, like the Bulgarians Ivan Shishmanov and Boyan Penev, or the Romanian Ioan Bogdan, charted massive ethnographic, folkloric, and literary borrowings that undermined the romantic notion of national uniqueness and shaped a space of cultural osmosis ensuing from long-standing coexistence and interaction. The commonalities on the level of grammar, syntax, belief, and popular law, in turn, seemed to imply an underlying primeval unity in the way of thinking, mentality, and the unconscious. This trend was contemporaneous with the upsurge of psychological discourses and disciplines of comparative folk psychology and national characterology across Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. One of the outcomes of such studies was the notion of a Balkan mentality. Its diffusion, however, was not due, as it is commonly claimed, to dubious academic fashions external to the region that tended to portray the Balkan cultures as a sanctuary of patriarchal practices and lifestyles, which were long extinct elsewhere in Europe. In fact, it was the Serbian anthropogeographer Jovan Cvic who, for the first time, implemented this scientific, quote-unquote, scientific psychological approach to the Balkans. By the way, an approach that was later taken aboard by Fernand Braudel, elaborating on the link between the mental construction of populations and geographic factors. The interwar period saw the rise of new paradigms promoting ontological and cultural morphological models for explaining spatial similarities and differences. They were less concerned with interaction and diffusion between nations, which was so characteristic of the previous period, than with devising some common cradle and shared structures for these societies. That was the aim of the new science of Balkanology, driven by several Yugoslav and Romanian scholars. The time has come, wrote the editors of the Belgrade-based new journal Revue Internationale des Études Balkaniques, to contemplate the coordinating of national academic Balkan studies, giving them cohesion and above all orienting them towards the study of a Balkan organism that constituted one whole since the most distant times, and elucidating the elements of Balkan interdependence and unity, as Romanian medievalist Victor Papakostia put it. It is in this sense significant that at a time when the national historiographies were busy eliminating the Ottoman features from the national cultures, scholars of the Balkans endeavored to reverse the notion of the region as the Ottoman legacy in Europe. They did so not by asserting an inherent difference from the Ottomans, but by praising the Ottoman primitiveness and the segregation of the Christians under the Ottoman rule, which they saw as prerequisites for the preservation and development of the unique Balkan virtues and potential. The implication of this kind of argument was that had the Turks been more advanced, that is, more like the West, the culture and identity of the Balkan Christians would not have survived. This reading differed substantially from the contemporary Western view, which continued to describe the Ottoman rule as an aberration and unmitigated disaster, a black yoke that was held responsible for all the ills that plagued the development of the Balkan states. In this regard, the Western scholars of the Balkans found themselves in the same camp with the Balkan nationalists, not the Balkan regionalists. Even more remarkably, Balkan regional scholars considered the Western idea of nationhood as a misplaced importation that brought about the disruption of an organic society. And here is what Victor Papakostia wrote, and which is also quoted on the screen. The principle of nationality and later the right to self-determination has not found in our area the right time and the right solution. Created in the West and for the West, the idea of national states was borrowed by or enforced on the Balkans. No attempt was made to adapt this idea to the conditions of our region. It is hard to find another example in world history that reveals more clearly the catastrophic consequences of the blind application of an idea in disregard for the major natural realities. Against the tendency of framing the Balkans in terms of national discord, therefore, Balkan regionalists stressed the unnaturalness of nationalism and the difficulties it encountered in the region. Such a view predictably was unpopular outside the region at that time. Arnold Toynbee was one of the very few Western scholars who shared the view that the application of the utterly exceptional Western formula of making language the basis for political demarcation to the intermixed population of the Balkans and the Near East had resulted in huge human suffering and massacre, and, as he put it, diminishing returns in happiness and prosperity. From such positions, Balkan regionalists developed the theoretical and methodological parameters of the new science of Balkanology. This is the way they called it. Its domains outline a truly interdisciplinary field of study, from history, linguistics, and folklore to anthropology, demography, statistics, and human geography, to economic development, law, the arts, architecture, and literature. It is indeed remarkable that a genuine blueprint for what would come to be called area studies after the Second World War, aimed at total knowledge by combining the humanities and social sciences, originated in the 1930s in the Balkan region itself. On the symbolic level, the shift was no less stunning. Precisely at the time when the Western discourse of Balkanism reached its peak, and when the Balkans became increasingly recreated as the ultimate internal European other, in the local regional context, the term Balkans and being Balkan underwent systematic rehabilitation and veritable thriving as both a political and cultural concept. The movement toward a Balkan Conference and Balkan Pact, the founding of Balkan institutes to conduct Balkan research, and the appeals for Balkan consciousness, Balkan fatherland, and Balkan patriotism converged in the slogan, "The Balkans for the Balkan peoples." Accordingly, this new political concept was in explicit opposition to Southeastern Europe, which was found to be an artificial and faceless coinage. This forceful rearticulation was aimed not at eluding the Western Balkanism, but at directly confronting and emasculating it. Next to laying the grounds for a new study field, interwar Balkanologists sought to resignify the Balkans and turn its Orientalist semantics on its head. They did so through a series of parahistorical accounts about a primeval Balkan soul, regenerated Balkan culture, a proper cultural orientation and global mission, and regional self-reliance and self-sufficiency. The Balkans they tried to promote was not just a cultural, historical, and socio-economic entity, but an axiological category, one that embodied a peculiar value system underlain by cultural and moral elements. All this went well beyond coping with stigma and overturning self-stigmatization. Interwar academic Balkanism strived to supply the conceptual toolkit and the scholarly basis for the construction of a Balkan identification. While not denying the still persisting power of the nation state, this Balkanism pursued a more encompassing, regionally anchored collective identity. In the process, the Balkans gelled into a discrete civilizational sphere, occasionally, by the way, underpinned by overt racism and couched in moralizing oratory or metaphysical, even mystic references. Ironically, this representation borrowed heavily from the then fashionable ethno-ontological discourse praising ethnic authenticity, organicity, and autarky. In essence, the interwar Balkan idea was an emancipatory one. It was an attempt at offsetting the importance of small statehood in the geopolitical environment of the 1930s. And here is another quote: "To protect the Balkans as one entity, to preserve it for the Balkan peoples themselves," wrote one of the founders of the Balkanski Institute in Belgrade, "this today is the only true and the greatest national idea. Our patriotism, if it wants to be real, should be a Balkan patriotism. Furthermore, the Balkan idea, as conceived at that time, removed the compulsion to choose and define the identity of the Balkans between the poles of Europe and Asia. It asserted the existence of a strong and irreducible Balkan individuality, which valorized in-betweenness, liminality, and complexity. It sought to subvert the Western notion of progress, where different communities trod towards the pinnacle of history occupied by the West. It professed instead a proper Balkan time axis, leading from the deepest past to the present and future, where universal ancient virtues, the bedrock of European civilization, were continuously reenacted. Accordingly, the Balkan other was reimagined as the West's anthropological utopia, as the Westerner's alternative or possible self. He or she appeared as considerably more gifted, more admirable, even more appealing than the average banal Westerner. It is worth noting that such self-representation tallied, harmonized with a conspicuous strain in Central European and Western literature at that time that aestheticized Balkan underdevelopment, spontaneity, and artlessness. Arguably, this convergence of perspective was the outcome not of imitation, but of a flow of ideas and concepts between East and West. Thinkers as different in other respects as the German Slavicist Gerhard Gesemann, the British historian Robert William Seton Watson, and the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, saw in the pristine Balkans a way of exploring the contemporary challenges to the self-assurance of the West and of expressing the widely shared feeling of estrangement from modern life. From this perspective, engagement with the Balkans, both inside and outside of the region, was a way of engaging with wider domestic and transnational debates about the fate of Western modernity and progress. After the Second World War, the Balkans as a politically or economically relevant notion all but disappeared. It survived as a cultural historical space plowed by a cluster of historically oriented human sciences and as a terrain for exercising the soft power of cultural diplomacy. The proliferation of regionalist organizations and the consolidation of the Balkan studies as an autonomous field in the 1960s brought together cultural politics, geopolitics, and national propaganda, and marked a new wave of politicization of Balkan research. The major themes organizing the Balkanist academic discourse during those years were ethnogenesis and ethnocultural continuity, the impact of empires, the sources of backwardness and modernization, and the relations to Europe. These themes were approached from strongly normativist positions, marked by evolutionism, Eurocentrism, and teleological thinking. Unlike their predecessors, the post-war Balkanists showed no enthusiasm for devising a Balkan road to modernity. The neo-Marxist dependency, world economy, and core periphery paradigms did not produce visible resonance in the region in contrast to other parts of Eastern Europe. The same applied to contemporary nationalism studies. The dominant approach to modernization favored comparisons of the local stages of development with those in the West, rather than with neighbors or other peripheries. As a general rule, regional scholars tended to stress particular aspects of the common Balkanness where their nation could claim a special contribution. The periods that in theory featured as crucial for Balkan historical unity were partitioned in similar national chunks. It was common, for example, to offer selective Greek, Bulgarian, or Serbian perspectives to the Byzantine Empire, or to parcel the study of the Ottoman Empire into Greek, Bulgarian, or Serbian lands within teleological national narratives. Balkan studies were, in this sense, a virtual playground of methodological nationalism. Not surprisingly, such a regional approach did not affect the writing of national history, which remained a self-contained, didactic, and parochial field. Remarkably, communication across the Iron Curtain was made possible precisely by the consensually shared national framework of history writing and by neither side subjecting the national paradigm to any critical scrutiny. Thus, the American journal Southeastern Europe regularly published thematic issues devoted to key national anniversaries featuring the diehards of the Balkan national historiographies. The same was true of the German journal Südostforschungen. The historical Balkans thus came to be understood as a mosaic of national spaces validated by immutable ethnic or national communities fully conscious of their distinct character. Unlike interwar Balkanology, its post-Second World War continuation never went as far as to interrogate the basic theoretical premise of the discipline, namely the construction of boundaries per se. Overall, Balkan studies remained isolated from the theoretical and methodological debates taking place since the 1970s in general history and the social sciences, especially in political economy and nationalism studies in both Western and Eastern Europe. Finally, the post-1989 period has been characterized by a theoretical clash over the meaning of the Balkans. The reaction to the resurrected ghost of Balkanism in the wake of the Yugoslav wars of succession. In reaction to this resurrected ghost, some scholars, coming mainly from literary and cultural studies, sought to argue for the Balkans not as a product of geography, history, or culture, but as a place in a discourse geography, as they called it. A great deal of the research after the mid-1990s has centered around the nature of this discourse, as well as how it was established, its characteristics, and its critique. But there are also those who have continued to search for the historical or cultural reality of the Balkans, variously defined in terms of a cluster of structural and cultural characteristics or historical legacies. The theoretical discussions the Balkans gave rise to in this way placed the area at the center of the debates on the meaning of regions and the mechanisms for the production of space that has led to interrogating definitions, traits, and boundaries. So, what can we actually learn from the Balkan case about the production of regions itself? The entanglement of politics with scholarship appears as a major propeller of region making. The politicization of scholarly regionalisms related to, on the one hand, the great European states' economic and political interests in this area, and on the other, various local nationalist or federalist schemes typically conceived in response to external or domestic political pressure. Balkan regionalist projects were steeped in diametrically opposed value systems, conservative, national liberal, Marxist, social constructivists, etc. When we talk about supranational frameworks, we tend to believe that we are referring to politically progressive projects. However, many regional schemes spoke on behalf of far more ambiguous political stances. Consequently, the Balkans could be referred to as the root of European civilization or to be envisaged as the driver of an alternative anti-European value system. It could signify a younger Europe that would revitalize the old one or represent a stigmatizing notion denoting deficiency in civilizational terms to be overcome by consistent efforts at Europeanization. Yet the most enduring source of politicizing scholarly regional terminology is the fusion of regionalist and nationalist designs in the fields of politics, economy, or culture. The academic notion of the Balkans was construed in dialogue with national autarky and nation-centered scholarly paradigms. The outcome was patently ambivalent. Balkan regionalism could at one time erode and at another reinforce national differences. The drive for methodological rescaling beyond the national often originated from essentially nationalist agendas. There is indeed no clear-cut difference, but rather a complex relationship between the conceptualizations of the national and the regional. Nationalist arguments may be adduced to buttress a regionalist framework, and a regional definition may serve to bolster a nationalist project. Local regionalizations sometimes connected to and other times clashed with the regional discourses produced outside the region. The asymmetric counter-concepts of East and West set the general frame of the identity as marginal, but did not preempt the question of their future displacement. Intellectuals and scholars in the Balkans experimented with various strategies for exiting the East-West binary, thus enacting what Reinhard Koselleck described as a shift in the relation of experiential space and the horizon of expectation. To put it in a nutshell, as powerful as the post-Enlightenment Western discourse, or rather different national Western discourses of the European East and Southeast might have been, it was neither the sole nor at all times the dominant agent of regionalization. There were instead parallel Western and local, external and internal processes of conceptualization, which were not necessarily connected. The flow of ideas, concepts, and narratives, at any rate, was never unidirectional. That which distinguishes local academic projects is their take on the Balkans as an active concept, insisting that the Balkans is and should be treated as a subject. Local regional narratives conjured up their own mental maps, symbolic geographies, and maps of civilization, and pursued their own political ideological agendas. They were steeped in the debates on identity and evolved with reference to two main vectors, the nation and Europe. In the final analysis, the attraction of the Balkan idea seems to have resided in the symbolic resources that it provided for posing questions about modernity and negotiating the nation's relationship to the transnational cultural, social, and economic processes. This idea mediated the positioning of the individual nations with respect to Europe, global culture, and international order. It inscribed the local cultural historical heritage in global history, and it served as a modality for interrogating the premises and the direction of modernization. All this, on the other hand, should not be understood as suggesting the elimination of the hierarchy between knowledge production centers. Remarkably, cognitive asymmetry appeared less pronounced in the period before the Second World War, when scholars like Shishmanov, Cvic, Jorga, Papakostia, Budimir, and Skok showed themselves as eager and able to translate their local expertise into ingenious concepts and research methods. These scholars had reputations well beyond the region, and their ideas strongly influenced Western conceptualizations. Sometimes they went beyond the understanding of the Balkans. Thus, Cvic's influence is clearly attestable in both Fernand Braudel's conceptualization of the Mediterranean and the paradigm of Histoire des Mentalités. Jorga, on his part, partook in both Karl Lamprecht's project of Weltgeschichte and the new cultural history that prepared the ground for the Annales School. Such cases of knowledge transfer bespeak a movement of concepts and ideas that, although being asymmetrical, breaches the rampant view of a monodimensional West to East pattern. In contrast, the architects of the field after the Second World War, as a rule, resigned themselves to the role of confirming or refuting theories elaborated elsewhere, or piling up empirical, mainly nationally segmented works whose creative interpretation and synthesis was devolved on scholarly powerhouses outside the region. Most recently, the mass exodus of intellectuals from the Balkans post-1989 created a population of Balkan studies scholars bent on applying pre-packed post-colonial theory to the region in an attempt to validate their local competence in a globally relevant interpretative framework. Now, here I'd rather stop in the hope that my talk could illustrate, however patchily, some of the strategies that were used at the Balkan margins to challenge their asymmetric conceptualizations by devising various subversive regional categories, classifications, and alternative regional modes of collective identification.
Great. Thank you so much, Diana, for sharing this, I think, very good overview of these debates and also the position of Balkan historiography in the larger European and global debates. Thank you very much.